Hey everyone, so I'm going to be bringing you through a very basic tutorial on how to retexture building models in Attila. We're going to be looking at texturing the four main texture sheets associated with the building models, so that's the diffuse, the normal, specular and the gloss. And then we're going to look at some of the other steps that revolve around editing texture sheets as well. So there's three main programs we're going to be working with. That's GIMP, RPFM and RMEditor, and I'll leave links in the description for each of these. They're all free to download. Okay, so to use as an example for today, we're going to be working with this vanilla building model. If I bring over the property editor here in TED, we can see that this is called Western Townhouse 1. I work on the Medieval Kingdoms 1212 AD mod, and if I were to use this building in that mod, I would primarily use this for Western Europe regions. I can see it has that very stereotypical look to it, particularly with that stone. But if I wanted to make something for Southern Europe, say Iberia, Italy, I would need to have something else. Instead of making a completely custom model, what I could do is much more simply just retexture this model. So if we take a closer look at it, I can see that at the bottom there is this stone texture. So it runs all the way around and repeats on the foundation, and then it also repeats at the top in the chimney. If I were to change just that alone, I could actually make this building model look quite different, and I could make it fit into a more stereotypical Southern Europe look. And that's what I'm going to do here today as an example. Now, if you don't know what texture sheets that this building model uses, you're going to need to find that out, and the way that you can do that is by using RPFM. So Rustic Packfile Manager can be used to open the Models2 pack file in your Total War Attila data folder. I'm going to bring over my Windows Explorer here, and if you don't know where that's located, basically it'll be wherever you installed Steam. Usually that's your program files by 86 by default, but it might be in a custom installed spot like mine here, so I have it on my D drive. Then you need to go into Steam Library, Steam Apps, Common, Total War Attila, and Data. And if you scroll down there, you will find Models 2, and this is where all the vanilla Attila models are stored. So if I double click and open it up, it'll open with RPFM, and on the top left I can expand these files and folders to get to the buildings folder, and this is where all of the different various building models are stored. And if I go right down to the bottom to textures, here you will see that this is where all of the different textures then are stored. So this is what each of the building models use. Okay, going back into TED, we can see that the model is called Western Townhouse 1. So if you're working with a vanilla model, you'll need to note that down. If you have a custom model, you'll of course already know what that is in your own custom pack file. Going back into our Models 2 in RPFM, what I'm going to do is simply type that in. So Western Town, and straight away there it has filtered to it. And we can see that this folder has all the associated files to do with that building model. And what I'm going to want to do is extract that. So right click, extract. You can do it in any folder you like. I have a little tutorial folder here set up for it. So I'm going to click select folder, and that has now extracted everything into that folder. Now what I want to do is bring that up using Windows Explorer, and you can see in tutorial it has downloaded this file in the exact same folder layout or structure. So if I go into rigid models, buildings, the folder is there with all the same files that you can see above in RPFM. Now what we want to do is, using RMEditor, is open up the actual rigid model v2 file. Destruct01 is the main file that we were looking at in TED, or the main model. Destruct02, or sometimes what you see is 03 or 04, these are the next levels of destruction for that model. So I'll quickly show you what I mean by that in TED. we can see that this is Western Townhouse 1, what it looks like by default. But if I increase the struct level here, we can see that there's a different variation of that model that has a destroyed version. And depending on the model, you might find that there are multiple layers or multiple versions of this destruction. And each of those will use, of course, different textures. And that is what we're seeing here in our folder. Okay, so at the moment we're only concerned with the main file. So we're going to open this up, double click, and it should open with RMEditor. And without going into too much detail on how this works, at the most basic level, we can see here that each texture sheet is located for each of the destruct models. So we can see Western Roman Atlas Diffuse is here for our diffuse layer, Western Roman Atlas Normal is there for our normal, for our specular the same, for the gloss the same. So there is a texture sheet for each of these different levels. LOD is essentially the distance, so you can see if I go to LOD2 it's the exact same, but if you were making custom textures, you might put lower res versions for each of these, so that the more you zoom out, you can see it uses different ones. That's essentially what LOD is. But as far as group is concerned, there are two, and that's basically the model is pulling from two different sets of textures. So the first group is pulling from the Western Roman Atlas group. Second group is pulling from the Western Barbarian Atlas. Okay, what we need to do next is look for these two then in RPFM. I'm going to go back into it, get rid of this filter, and instead type in Western Barbarian. And I'm going to look in textures, and I can see here we have the diffuse, we have the gloss, we have the normal, and we have the specular. And from looking at the diffuse, straight away I can see that this is the texture that that model is primarily using. It is pulling some other textures from Western Roman Atlas. But if I minimize this, go back into TED, bring this back to its normal destruct level, and put it side by side with that texture sheet, I can see there the roof is using this top texture, the wooden panels are using here, and the stone foundation is using this section here. That's essentially how a texture sheet works. It will have multiple textures on it, and your building models will pull from specific areas. Okay, so we now know this is the texture sheet that we need to edit. What we're going to do is take the four of them, shift click or control click and get all of them. Once they're all selected, right click and we're going to select extract. I'm going to put them into that same tutorial folder that we had. That's done. And now if I go into there, go back out to tutorial and rigid models buildings, the same where we had Western Townhouse in our buildings, we now also have a textures folder. And here are our four individual textures. The next step we want to do is edit them. So we're going to open all of these in GIMP. And when you first open these in GIMP, we're going to make sure that we deselect load bitmaps. We're going to want to create them later ourselves. Okay, I now have all four textures associated with that model opened in GIMP. And what I want to find now is a texture to replace the stone with. I'm trying to go for something that looks a bit more Southern European, as opposed to this stone, which you could say is a bit more Western. And even from this very same texture sheet, I can see that there's a stone texture down here that would suit perfectly. That's what I'm going to use for this example. Now, what you might find is you will have to get it from a different texture sheet. The same principles will apply to that as will here. What you can do, however, is use existing assets, and it's actually what I recommend. If you're very good with editing in GIMP or even Photoshop, by all means feel free to just edit these as they are yourself. But what I find that is faster and definitely miles easier is to simply copy paste from existing texture sheets. And there are loads if I open up RPFN to choose from. Again, go into your textures folder, and you will see there is a wide variety of textures to pull from. Okay, so what we want to do now is copy paste the texture that we want to replace it with. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to first establish where that texture starts and ends. If I zoom in a little bit more, I can actually see the line runs here. This is a separate texture to this one down here. This is the area that I actually need to change. For simplicity's sake, I'm actually going to copy this entire part, and we'll get into a little bit more why in just a second. So I'm going to start by selecting my rectangle tool. I'm going to roughly get where this begins in the top left corner and just go right down to the bottom right. I'm going to try and capture where it ends just before that black line there. I don't want to get that black line because textures repeat on building models. So if you have that black line copied in, what you might find is that when this texture sits on top of itself, that black line will show. Whereas if you don't have it, the texture will just merge together seamlessly. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more just to make sure I have this right. I don't want to capture these darker areas. And then I'm going to check the sides to make sure that we're not going over the side. So that can go out a little bit more, and this side is already perfect. Okay, so Control C, Control V, and we're just going to bring that up, and we're going to now line it up with the bottom left corner. So if I lower the opacity now, we will see that this is going over where we want it to, and we're going to need to fix that. For simplicity's sakes, I'm actually going to replace both of these models so that we can see it on more than just that one building model. And what I'm going to need to do for that is start in the bottom left, click and drag, and you'll see it will instantly go to the outermost regions and it won't let you go any further. And the only part that you will need to line up correctly is just the top part, because they are the same dimension. And if I zoom in, I can just adjust this perfectly. You can see there that's done. And then I'm going to bring up the opacity back to 100, select my move tool, and then left click anywhere on the texture sheet to anchor it. And that is now done. What's going to happen now is when the building model pulls from this texture sheet, it's going to pull this section here, and then for any other building models that use this top part, it will now pull this more southern looking stone. And if there are any models that use the two of them together, which some of them do, and that is why they almost seem to kind of blend in with each other, they will now look better. So it's important to note that if you are retexturing for multiple models, that you take into account just how many models will be pulling that texture. With that now done, what we're going to do is save this. We're going to go to File and Export As. I'm going to go into whatever folder we want to work off. We're going to hit Export. And then for compression, for diffuse files, we're going to select BC1 DXT1. And for bitmaps, we're going to select Generate Bitmaps. Everything else can be left as default. So if you want to pause the video and just make sure yours are like that as well, do. And just to note, for specular and gloss maps, you will also be using this compression of BC1. So we can hit Export then, and that is now saved. If we go into Windows Explorer, go back out to where we have saved that folder, we can now see that there we go, Western Barbarian Atlas Diffuse, that is saved correctly. To move on then to our normal map, as you'll see, the normal map is coming up as blue, whereas if you view it elsewhere, it will come up as orange, and we'll need to address that. So we won't just be copy pasting the textures, we'll also be changing the color. For what reason, I do not know why it has to be orange. Apparently it does, unless you process it through Bob. But if you want it to work straight out from GIMP, these are the steps you'll need to follow. Okay, Just as we did with our diffuse layer, we're going to do the exact same steps. So I am going to copy paste this section that we want. Control C, Control V. I'm going to bring it up here and line the corner as best I can. Reduce the opacity. Select my crop tool. If you're working with textures that are too big as well, you do have the scale tool up here. That is also handy to use. Just be aware that you will be making textures smaller. But we will stick with the crop tool for here. So again, I'm going to select the whole thing or start from the bottom left corner and then just adjust this top bit. So zoom in to get a better view. Bring that up. Put the opacity back up. Select my move tool, left click anywhere. That's now anchored in. That is your texture done, but now we need to address again the blue shading. And how we do that is we go into channels here on the right hand side. We're going to select red, we're going to right click, and we're going to duplicate channel. We're going to go back into layers and select our texture sheet. Then we're going to go into colors on the top tab, go down to levels, and for this channel value we're going to select blue. Selecting blue now, we're going to go down to output levels and we're going to drag this black triangle all the way up. Or excuse me, we're going to drag the white triangle all the way down. We're going to select OK, and then going into channels we're going to deselect red and we're going to select blue instead. And I'm going to do the same thing, colors, levels, channel select instead. This time we're going to select red, and then we're going to bring the black triangle all the way up. And then we're going to see this is now changed to orange. Going back into layers on the right hand side, we're going to right select our texture sheet and we're going to select add layer mask. The default settings are correct, so just make sure that yours align with this. We're going to press add, and then we're going to right click again, merge visible layers. Default selections are fine, so just make sure again you're aligned and hit merge. And then we're done. So to export this, the exact same as we did with the diffuse, we're going to go to export as, find your folder, and export. And unlike the diffuse where we selected a compression of BC1, we're instead going to select BC3 for normal layers. Generate bitmaps is selected and then hit export. And if we go into our folder, we can see that that is now done. Okay, as for specular and gloss, what you will find most of the time is you do not need to edit these. You can see that gloss is just a red version of the diffuse. This is basically telling the game how shiny to make these surfaces. If it's red, it's not going to do all that much, but if you were to change it to be more yellow or the most extreme level green, it will basically make these surfaces very shiny. So if you were working with a metal roof, for example, you would want to edit this, but we won't need to. And even though you can see it has the old textures, we're still not going to need to edit this. And the same goes for the specular level, which in this case is just a white sheet. If for any reason you don't have a specular map and you need to create one, the simplest way to do this is take your diffuse, put it into grayscale, and then export that as your specular. Your diffuse map in grayscale or in black and white is essentially what a load of the specular maps are as well. Why, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a texture expert, but if you set it that way, it will work fine. The next step will be to actually put these into a pack file, so both TED and the game can read these. And what we need to do for that is open up RPFM. We are going to create a new pack file, and then we're going to right click on unknown.pack and we're going to select add. Instead of adding an individual file, we're going to add an entire folder, and wherever we were previously extracting our files from the models2 pack file, we're going to very simply now just select this rigid models folder. So again, to remind you, this is where we extracted the original Western Townhouse model, and it's where we also extracted our textures. So selecting this and then select folder, it has now brought all of those files into our pack file. We don't need this Western Townhouse one, so you can delete that if you want, but we're going to leave it in for future use in another tutorial. And here we have our vanilla textures. So as we saw before, our gloss and our specular we didn't bother editing, so we can simply delete those. And as for our diffuse and normal, we're going to want to replace these now with the edited textures that we made. So we're going to right click on our textures folder, we're going to select add and add file. We're going to make sure that these are the two new ones that we made. Select them both, select open, and now that has imported in the new versions of the textures. So you can see this is where we replace the stone in that middle section, and again on the normal layer. What we're going to need to do next is save this pack file. So we're going to first create a movie pack file, which is what TEd will be able to read. So go to pack file, change pack file type, select movie, and then save. We're going to put this into our Attila data folder. I'm going to save this as tutorial movie. That now being in the data folder means TEd will be able to read it. And what we're also going to do to test this in the game is make a movie version. So first change pack file type and put it as mod. Then again save as, and instead of movie we'll name it mod. And again save that to our data folder. Now what you want to do is, if you had TEd open during all that time, anytime you add new pack files or you edit any existing ones, you're going to have to relaunch TED just to make sure that the changes come into effect. And that's what I've done here. So now I can go into buildings. I'm going to find my Western Buildings 1, and there it is. And as you can see, the stone has been replaced perfectly. That now looks like something more from a southern region, which is exactly what I was going for. It's been replaced all along the foundation and on the chimney, and none of the other textures have been affected. What's worth mentioning quickly is if I zoom in very close here, you can see there's a minor black line. So that's an indication of where the texture is repeating. If I were to open it up quickly again here, we can see that the texture is essentially this square or rectangle here. And what's happening on the model is it is repeating it twice all the way around. The result is that there is a minor black line. And what that means is that the texture actually goes all the way to down here. So it doesn't look great. What you should always remember though is most people playing Total War are looking at your models from a distance like this. So for that reason it doesn't really matter too much. But if you're extremely picky like me, it's worth noting to ensure that when you're copy pasting your models, you don't leave little gaps like this. Bring it all the way down to where the second texture starts, and that way if it's repeating on itself, you can ensure that there's no lines appearing like this, and it will look more seamless, just like in the vanilla model. But for the most part, that is now perfect, and we can take a look at what it looks like quickly in game as well. And when you open up your Total War launcher, you want to make sure that you activate the pack file in which you saved your new textures. If there are any existing mods that might conflict with that texture, make sure you disable them. But find where it is, tutorial mod, that's the name, activate it, and then select play. Okay, and here we are in game with a version of the model in front of us. As we can see, the new textures are looking pretty good. They're even blending in with all the other vanilla Roman models. So if I was going for more of a southern European look, something in Italy, this is now perfect. And instead of having to go create an entirely new model, I've been able to simply reuse the existing vanilla model and just retexture not even the whole thing, just one little aspect of it. That is why retexturing, in my opinion, is really useful. It's quite simple and allow you to get much more assets to use without having a modeler working full time. So what we essentially did there was overwrite the vanilla texture that this model was pulling from. The issue with that is there might be other models that are also pulling from that texture sheet that will now be using that stone too, and that may be something that you don't want. Additionally, you might want to have many different versions of this model with different stone textures. So in my case, I want to use the vanilla texture for Western Europe, say, and I want to use this new one now for Southern Europe. I cannot do that because I've just overwritten the vanilla texture, and how you get around that is just by duplicating the model. So you can make as many different versions of the texture as you want, and all you have to do then is just duplicate the model as many times in order to have as many variations of that model with each of the different textures. And we will cover how to do that in the next video. So we'll look at how to duplicate a model and how to apply the unique texture sheets to it. Okay, but that'll be it for today.